Hey, what's up guys? It's Rick with the Digital Divide, and today I want to talk about Microsoft's acquisition of Activision Blizzard. As of yesterday, October the 13th, the deal has officially gone through. Microsoft spent a whopping $69 billion to acquire Activision. Some people might question whether or not they have the IP to support that dollar amount, but it wasn't easy for them. The FTC, which is the Federal Trade Commission in the United States, unsuccessfully attempted to get a temporary injunction issued by a judge because they were concerned that this purchase would put Microsoft one step closer to a monopoly, but ultimately the judge ended that court hearing in Microsoft's favor. And that's mostly due to a couple of caveats in the acquisition that I'll touch on later. The EU also attempted to block this deal, and in fact, they did temporarily block the deal in Europe. The only problem, though, is that once the FTC court hearing ended in Microsoft's favor and the judge determined that they didn't have a leg to stand on as far as a monopoly is concerned. So the EU eventually relented and approved this deal so long as Microsoft doesn't publish their cloud-based games in Europe. And instead, Microsoft made a deal with Ubisoft so that Ubisoft will publish all of their cloud-based games over in Europe. So now that the dust has settled and Microsoft owns all of these new properties, what does that mean? Are all of these Activision and Blizzard games going to all of a sudden appear on Xbox Game Pass, for example? Well, the answer is complicated. So now that this deal is done, Microsoft owns all of the franchises and intellectual property of Activision, Blizzard, and King. If you're not familiar with King, King is huge in the mobile space. They make a lot of cell phone games. Candy Crush is probably the one you're most familiar with, but I personally could not care less about King or any of the IPs that they own. I don't play their IPs, so I'm not even going to discuss them during this conversation, but Microsoft definitely got some heavy hitters from Activision and Blizzard. Inarguably, the biggest franchise that they acquired here on the Activision side, at least, was Call of Duty. And Call of Duty is massive. It's one of the biggest game franchises on planet Earth. It is consistently the best-selling game almost every year that it releases. It's just a moneymaker, and as a result, this franchise in particular was a big point of contention during the Federal Trade Commission's lawsuit against Microsoft. Call of Duty has been a PlayStation staple for years and years and years, and to all of a sudden have this franchise taken away from Sony consoles, they argued that not only would this really hurt Sony as a platform holder since it generates so much revenue from this franchise, but it would also stifle competition because there really isn't anyone that can compete with Call of Duty when it comes to competitive first-person shooters. So as a result, in order to get the deal through, Microsoft made a deal. Phil Spencer stated publicly during the trial hearing that not only would they not take away Call of Duty for PlayStation consoles, but they signed a contract guaranteeing that for the next 10 years, every Call of Duty game will come to PlayStation consoles and Nintendo consoles, and that's a big deal because the Nintendo Switch has not gotten a single Call of Duty since its release. So Call of Duty is not going to be all of a sudden become an Xbox exclusive. It's going to remain a third-party game, at least for the next 10 years. So what other IPs does Activision have that are worthwhile? Well, surprisingly, most of Activision's other IP are franchises that are either long since dormant and haven't had a new release in a while, or they are closely aligned with PlayStation. Those franchises include Spyro the Dragon, Tenchu Stealth Assassin, and even Crash Bandicoot, which used to be a mascot for the Sony brand. In fact, Sony put out some hilarious videos back in the 90s where they used Crash Bandicoot as a mascot against Nintendo.
Hey, plumber boy, mustache man, your worst nightmare has arrived.
Pack up your stuff. I got a little surprise for you here. Check it out. What do you think about that? We got real-time, 3D, lush organic environments. How's that make you feel, buddy? Feel a little like your days are numbered?
And what's even more weird is that Crash Bandicoot was developed by Naughty Dog. Naughty Dog is now a first-party developer by Sony. But being the developers of all of the original Crash Bandicoot games, they didn't own the rights to the franchise. Activision owned the rights and still do own the rights today. So it's just very bizarre to see Crash Bandicoot now become an Microsoft-owned IP. Naughty Dog is one of the best developers on planet Earth. They went on to become a Sony first-party, wholly owned studio and develop the Uncharted franchise for them, as well as The Last of Us for Sony platforms. So they've become an invaluable asset on Sony's side. Okay, so what else does Activision own that's worthwhile? Well, one of the IPs that Microsoft now owns from Activision is Guitar Hero, and it's been dormant for a while. People got fed up with the plastic peripherals, but it does have a lot of history in the gaming space. Another franchise they own is Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, which was recently remastered on both Sony and Microsoft consoles, but is a series that kind of waned in popularity over the years, and there hasn't been a new entry in a while that has been highly regarded. Another franchise owned by Activision is one that I think a lot of people are sleeping on, and that is Pitfall. Pitfall, when you think about it, there hasn't been a game released in the Pitfall name in quite some time, and the ones that have been released in the past were very dull and were very basic when it came to gameplay, mechanics, and story, and that has to do with the limitation of the hardware that it was released on originally. But if you look at Pitfall, it really has a lot of similarities to something like Uncharted or Tomb Raider, and Microsoft doesn't have a game like that is first party made on their platform. So I think Pitfall is a sleeper IP for them that was recently picked up that could help them fill in that software gap and give them something like an Uncharted that is exclusive to the Xbox platform. The coolest franchise that I think that Microsoft picked up, though, has got to be Hexen. Hexen is an amazing game that came out in the 90s. It was basically Doom, but it took place in a really R-rated horror-themed medieval setting, and it was so much fun. The enemy variety was great. The weapons and spells are really fun to play around with. This game got ports on pretty much everything. I played it on the Saturn, PC, Nintendo 64, and on the PC as well. So what about Blizzard Entertainment? What IPs did Microsoft acquire from them? Well, in my opinion, this is where most of the heavy hitters come from, and maybe I'm a little bit biased, but they picked up franchises like Overwatch, Diablo, Warcraft, and StarCraft. And if you're thinking to yourself, these are really PC-oriented games that don't translate well to their console market, they do. Keep in mind, they own the franchise as well as the characters and storylines. They don't have to translate to the exact same genre that they were before. If we look at StarCraft Ghost, for example, this was Blizzard's attempt to take an existing franchise and turn it into a completely new gaming experience. In this case, it was going to be a third-person action-adventure shooter. So the question that remains is, was this acquisition worth the $69 billion that it cost them? Initially, when this was announced, I thought to myself, there's no way this is going to pan out for Microsoft. It didn't make sense to me when you look at the cost they were spending compared to what they were getting out of it. Specifically, if we look towards their acquisition of Bethesda a few years ago, they spent far less money to acquire Bethesda, and in my opinion, they got a lot more from that acquisition. A lot of people forget they got id Software with that acquisition, Machine Games, Arcane Studios, Tango Gameworks. Some of the best developers on the planet all came with Bethesda. They also picked up Ninja Theory, Double Fine Studios, Obsidian Entertainment. I mean, they were on a shopping spree. But if you take a look at the IP they picked up, at first glance it may seem peculiar, but then you realize that it fills in gaps. Spyro and Crash Bandicoot, for example, fills in the family-friendly gap that Sony has with franchises like Ratchet & Clank. Microsoft didn't really have an equal there. The remaining question here is, when are these games going to come to Game Pass now that the deal is officially done? Well, the answer to that is 2024. Specifically, Q1 and Q2 of 2024 is when the majority of these games are expected to become available on Game Pass, but there's still so many unanswered questions here. For example, will Call of Duty be included in Game Pass? There is some confusion about the 10-year deal that was inked between Sony and Nintendo. Initially, when that deal was in its first stages of talks, having Call of Duty be included on Game Pass on day one was a hard no for Sony. But things have changed, and now Sony has very little say in that. So we'll see where all of this pans out, but for now, that's going to do it for me. Let me know in the comments below what you think about this acquisition.